Well, hey there everyone. So it is past Thanksgiving and now into December, so it is officially Christmas time. And it's been a while since I've actually sewn a piece of clothing because I've been doing a lot of crafty things lately. So I feel like I want to ease my way back into that. And to do that, I am going to sew something that I've been seeing going around on sewing TikTok for a little bit, and that is the Millie dress. But because of the season, we're going to make it Christmas themed. So the Millie dress, which I will throw somewhere right here, is basically just like a really pretty 3-tiered, 4-tiered dress depending on how many tiers you want to do. I'm gonna do 3. Now something that is a little unique that I've never seen before in an item of clothing is, so for the neckline up in the front and then down to the back, it has basically like a cinch if you kind of look at the dress, which you will see a bit later, to where you can tie it in the back and it just kind of cinches everything together, I suppose. So I thought that was a really unique aspect to a dress. And then obviously the waves on the bottom is another unique part of this dress. So this is something that's going to require an incredible amount of bias tape. So we're going to worry about that later, but let me get into the materials for this dress. So for the main material, I did go thrifting and I found this king sheet that should be enough for some of this dress. And then to break up some of the busyness of that material and add a little bit to it, I also have this green that I had thrifted forever ago, and I have been dying to get it out of my stash because it's just not my favorite green. So this I think works well to kind of break up the pattern a bit. And it is Christmassy, so I have already cut out all of the pattern pieces. So we just have to get to cutting material out. So today is likely going to be a shorter day just because I had an order to do for my Etsy and I was kind of having a slow morning. So I only have a couple hours left before I have plans for tonight. So I'm going to mainly focus on getting all of the material cut out, and then maybe even including the bias tape. That would be a really big step to finish as well. So I'm going to focus on that today, and then if I get to sewing, it'll be getting the top together. But for now, we're just gonna cut these out, and then tomorrow, hopefully I can get everything all sewn and done. So let's go ahead and get to that. Alright, so the first thing I have to do is cut out the material, and through the magic of editing, you do not have to see me crawl around the floor like a little crab to cut out all of these pieces. So the top tier and the bottom tier of the skirt is going to be made out of this material, and then the middle tier is going to be made out of this green material, which you can see I didn't have a crazy amount of, so I did have to shorten it just a little bit. And then once everything was cut out, I was going to focus on cutting out the bias tape. Now I would have preferred to do the infinite bias tape method where you kind of sew a square together and cut it out, but I did not have that kind of real estate on the material left, so I ended up using the side seams of the bedsheet and the green curtain material to cut out my bias tape. Okay, it is day 2, and I didn't accomplish a terrible amount yesterday. I did get all of the pieces cut out, so all the bodice pieces and all of these skirt pieces, so I did have enough, thankfully. However, the second tier of the darker green, I did have to cut the skirt a little bit shorter, or not as wide, because I didn't have enough material, but I think it's still gonna work out fine. And then I also started cutting out the bias tape yesterday. I would have preferred to do the infinite bias tape method where you sew a square together and cut it out, but I didn't have a big enough piece of material to do that, so I'm basically just going around all of the edges of the sheets and later the curtain and cutting off my bias tape. Now to make this job infinitely easier on me, I am going to be using one of these bad boys. And I opted to do the smaller bias tape, one, so that I can get as much bias tape as I can from this material, because I'm gonna need a lot. And 2, since this goes around all of the wavies of the skirt, I felt like if I used a bigger bias tape, it would be too stiff. So I'm just gonna use the little guy and it'll work out. And the bias tape measurement tool that I'm using says 12 millimeters, so that is how big my bias tape is going to be. So I'm basically cutting out an inch of this material, but since it's on a fold, I'm just cutting out half an inch and then it will work out. So today I just have to keep cutting out this bias tape. I think I want to try and tackle the skirt first just because that's the longest part. So if I can get the skirt done and don't have time today, I can quickly finish the bodice tomorrow and still film the final reveal. But ideally, I would like to finish this dress today. So let's go ahead and keep making like 20 yards of bias tape and then we will get going on the skirt. Now I'm going to be using a bias tape maker for this just to make my life like significantly easier. And for that I needed to cut out 1 inch of material, but since this is on a fold, I just needed to cut out half an inch of each of the edges of this material. And I basically just cut out all that I could because I knew that I was going to need an incredible amount of bias tape, but I ended up cutting out more than I needed to. And then, like I said, I was using this little bias tape maker, and I don't think this is how you are supposed to use it, but this is how I'm using it. So basically you just like feed your strip through and then just kind of like pull and iron along, and it gives you that bias tape fold. Now I discovered this far too late, but I found that the best method, rather than using the iron to push it along, was to push it like an inch and then iron on top of it and then pull it an inch and iron on top of it. That gives like the best, but this is just what I did. And then once I have the primary like bias tape shape, then I need to fold it in half to create the actual bias tape. And then once the darker green was done, now I can work on the king shade material. So again, it's the same method. I'm just going to put it into this bias tape maker and then iron it along and then fold it in half and iron that. And then once I have all of my strips sewn, then I can sew all those strips together and just make a really long bias tape of each of these materials. And then here are all of my tiers and the bias tapes prepped for them. So before I could put the bias tape on, I had to actually sew these skirt panels together. So the first tier is going to be 4 panels that are going to be sewn together, and I need to leave a little 6-inch gap at the top of each of the tiers for the zipper. So right sides together, I'm going to pin them and then sew them down, and I am going to serge the edges. And then for the little gap that I left for the zipper, I'm also going to individually serge each of those little sides. And then the middle and bottom tier are just 2 big pieces, so I'm just going to pin them right sides together and sew them and serge them, again leaving the little top part for the zipper. And now it was finally time to add the bias tape onto the little wavy parts on the bottom of the skirt. So to do this, I'm going to open up my bias tape, and then on the inside of the skirt, I'm going to place the right side of the bias tape onto the wrong side of the material. And then I'm just going to sew on that bottom seam along the curves of the skirt. Now this was a little tricky to get a hang of. It's a little wonky, but I eventually did it in the end. So I'm just going to do this around all of the bottoms of each of the tiers of the skirt. And then once you sew the bias tape open, then you're just going to turn your material right sides out, and then I'm going to fold the bias tape over and then sew along the little edge to close the bias tape. Now this was also very tricky to do, and I didn't do it very well, but as soon as I ironed it, and if you're looking at it from a distance, it looks perfectly fine. Okay, it is day 3, and here's where I am at. So I got the first biggest skirt done. It looks a little rough up close, but from far away it looks nice and neat. I did not get the second 2 done, so I am almost done with them. I sewed the bias tape onto the back, and I just have to fold it over and then sew it again on the middle skirt and the top skirt. So I am almost done with the skirts, but I am behind on schedule. So I have to finish these up and then sew all the skirts together, and then I can get to the bodice. So I am on a bit of a time crunch today because I do still have to film this reveal today as well. So once I finish the skirts, then I can start putting the top together, which I don't think will take too long. So I think I can get this done today and the final reveal, hopefully. So let's go ahead and get to finishing the bias tapes on these skirts, and then we can start on the bodice. Alright, so it is the last day, and I'm just going to continue sewing this bias tape onto the skirt, and it's going a little bit better than the day before, but it's still pretty frustrating. And then finally, once all the bias tape was sewn, it was time to deal with the skirts and putting them all 3 together. So I found that my middle and my bottom tier of the skirt was just a little too big, so I did put a little gathering stitch in it so that I could sew all 3 of the layers together. And then once I gathered all 3 of the skirts to the right size, then I could put all of the skirts inside each other, and then I'm just going to sew around the top just to connect them all. Alrighty, these skirts are finally all done and all put together, so now it is time to work on the bodice, and then we can finally put everything together and film the final reveal. And now it was finally time for the bodice to be put together. So for both the outer fabric and the lining, we're just going to take the front of the bodice piece and the back of the bodice piece and sew the 2 sides onto the center of the bodice. And then it was time to take the front and back bodice pieces and sew them together. So I'm going to sew them together on the shoulder and then down the side, and I need to make sure to sew opposite sides of these bodice pieces. because one side is going to be left open for the zipper, so when I turn them right sides out, then the same side will be open. So now we're going to place the outer fabric and the lining right sides together and then just sew around the neckline. And then we can clip those curves and then turn our right sides out and iron it. And then while I was ironing the neck, before I sewed anything else together, I wanted to fold over the edge of the armhole and just iron that, because later what we're going to do to finish the armhole is just like tuck in the two edges and top stitch it. So ironing it while everything was still kind of apart made it a lot easier. And so this is me top stitching the armhole, and it was just so much easier once I had ironed and clipped everything. And then now it was time for that little cinch part to go around the neckline. So I ended up using just like a store-bought bias tape that I'd already had, and I'm just going to literally put it on top of the neckline and sew both the top and the bottom edges of this bias tape all the way around. And I'm making sure to leave a little gap on the back, which I measured about 1 inch, so that I can have the ribbon come in and out and then tie it. And then finally it was time to sew the bodice onto the skirt, so just right sides together I'm going to sew all of those. And then to keep the edges all nice and clean on the inside, I did put a bias tape around all of the raw edges where the bodice and skirt meet. And then finally it was time to add the zipper, so I'm just going to do the kind of lazy method where I'm just going to sew that part down. And then I'm going to sew the zipper on and then just seam rip that open, and I have a zipper attached. And with that, we are finally done after I put the ribbon in the neckline, and we are finally ready for the final look. Alrighty, and here is the dress. I think this turned out so cute. I look like a little Christmas tree. So underneath this dress, I did put a little petticoat because I love it when a dress is poofy. So I did add that addition to underneath. But other than that, it's like still really good without it. Now, I think this pattern was really good. It came together really nicely. I didn't have to adjust any of the sizing, so that was really cool. And then with the like cinched neckline, it was able, like before I had put the ribbon in to cinch it, it was a little like large on the top, but it was fixed. So that was fantastic. And I think the layers are really, really fun. The little like swoopies are fun. However, it sucked to make. They were quite difficult. So if you were to make this pattern, get ready for some long hours and some difficult times making some swoopies in bias tape. But other than that, it came together really, really nicely. And I'm really happy with this sheet that I thrifted. It's just like such a pretty material. And I think breaking it up with the green in the middle definitely cancels some of the noise that it has, because it is quite a lot of stuff on it. And it kind of makes me look a little bit more like a Christmas tree, but I think I'm okay with that because this is a Christmas dress. So yeah, I would highly recommend this pattern if you feel like doing it. Again, it will be linked down in the description, so go ahead and check it out. And get ready for some Christmas content and end of year content. Since it is one of the busiest months, I'm going to try and post next week and the week after, and then take like a little week or two break for the new year and the holidays. So we'll see what I can come up with. But anyways, thanks for hanging out with me and making this Christmas dress with me. So anything to do, if you like what I did, go and like and subscribe. I post most Saturdays, mostly at noon, and I will see you in my next video. Thank you for watching.